Hey, y'all, and welcome to tonight's live stream. Rex Heuermann is accused of killing 4 sex workers in a period of 4 years. But are there more bodies out there? When law enforcement finishes all the investigations, when the dust clears, will law enforcement blame him for more murders than the ones he's presently being charged with? Tonight, we're going to talk about law enforcement's search for more bodies that Rex Heuermann may have left behind over the years. And I want to say a quick note. I get comments fairly frequently from people who talk about the pronunciation of Heuermann, and I gather that maybe in German, Heuermann might be a better way to pronounce it. I went to an interview of Rex Heuermann and listened to it over and over again, and he introduces himself, and the way he says his name is Heuermann. So I'm going with that because that's what he picked. So that's how I'm going with it. I hope you all had a great weekend. Our thoughts really go out to our California subscribers and listeners who are dealing with both hurricane effects and an earthquake, which is on top of, isn't it? That's really a lot to deal with. So our thoughts go out to you. So let's talk about Rex Heuermann. The prosecution says he killed 4 sex workers in a 4-year period, 2007 to 2010. Of course, that case has not been proven yet. But so take Rex Heuermann out of it just for a second. Ask yourself, just in general, about a serial killer. Ask yourself, what are the chances that a serial killer contacted a sex worker named Maureen Brainerd Barnes and murdered her in 2007, and contacted a sex worker named Melissa Barthélemy in 2009 and murdered her, and contacted a sex worker named Megan Waterman in June 2010 and murdered her, and another sex worker named Amber Costello in September 2010 and murdered her. And assume that after these 4 murders, the killer's behavior stayed exactly the same. The killer kept contacting and meeting up with sex workers. The killer continued to make internet searches about really sick and sadistic things. How likely is it that that person never killed anyone else? Not before 2007 and not after 2010. How likely is that? If you're like most people, you're probably thinking to yourself, I don't think that's real likely. I would be very concerned. The idea that the person abruptly started in 2007 and abruptly stopped in 2010, just really bad 4 years. I don't know what came over me, just really bad 4 years. It's all over now. It just doesn't seem very likely. And if you're thinking that, you're not alone. Law enforcement is thinking that also. Here, let me go ahead and share my screen with you. Here is what the law enforcement said. Shame on us if we don't look into Las Vegas, South Carolina, even Atlantic City. So law enforcement is well aware that there may be issues that law enforcement needs to be considering, that there may be other incidents out there, that they may be other murders that Rex Heuermann should be charged with. So they are looking for that. And what I want to do tonight is talk about where are they looking and what are they looking for. And I'll give you one more quote about what they said. They said, investigators are looking into Heuermann in connection with cases around the nation, including Atlantic City, Las Vegas, and South Carolina. We are going to talk about all 3 of those locations and what it is that Rex Heuermann may be suspected of, or that they may at least be considering whether or not he might have had some involvement in that. Now, as to the Heuermann, and speaking of shame on me if I don't ask you to hit the like button, please, and to subscribe. We go live Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. and would love to have you come back. We talk about all the cases everybody's talking about, the legal cases that are in the news, and make them understandable. So I'd love to have you back. Now, as to the Heuermann case, law enforcement now has a huge advantage as it goes out and looks at other cases, an advantage it did not have before, because now they have Heuermann's DNA. They initially got some of that from the pizza box, where they found a discarded pizza box and tested the pizza crust and found some of Heuermann's DNA on that. But we don't really know anything about the quantity or the quality that they got from that. We do know that they asked for a buccal cheek swab from Heuermann. They wanted more, something very specific directly from him, straight from the horse's mouth, if you will. Heuermann opposed that. His attorneys argued there was no probable cause. I think the court probably figured if there's enough probable cause to keep you in prison without, or in jail without bail, then there's probable cause enough to at least get a cheek swab. So the court disagreed with that, and law enforcement now has Rex Heuermann's DNA, both from the pizza and from the cheek swab. Now, for years, police have been taking DNA at crime scenes. Sometimes they simply took items that could later be tested for DNA, but hadn't even been tested yet. Increasingly, police are looking at old cold cases and going back and either doing testing or tracing the testing or trying to use genetic genealogy to track both the victims, identify them, and sometimes the murderers. In cases where they have DNA, they can now compare to Rex Heuermann's DNA. Now let's take a look at what we know about the search, and we're going to start. We are going to start close to home because, and these are the spots where they will be looking, and we're going to start close to home because first we're going to ask ourselves, what about Gilgo Beach? Because Rex Heuermann is only charged with 3 murders from Gilgo Beach. He's only charged with 3 murders, and he's the chief suspect in a 4th. But there, in fact, were quite a number of bodies or body parts found along Gilgo Beach on Long Island. So you can see here that this was a drawing put out by the police, and you can see that there were a number of bodies found there, and Rex Heuermann is only charged with 3 and suspected in a 4th. All the rest have not been associated with any particular person at this time, no particular murderer. Most of them had a lot of similarities. They were known sex workers. One was the child of a sex worker. But Heuermann hasn't been charged. Now, the ones he was not charged with had a different means of killing for the most part. For maybe not a different means of killing, but they were presented differently in the way their bodies were found. For many of them, they were dismembered and only parts of their bodies were found there on Gilgo Beach. The Gilgo 4, the ones he is either charged or suspected of, were all found, the women were found intact. They were wrapped in cloth. And so they seemed to have a similarity as if one person had done that. There's no indication right now that police intend to charge Rex Heuermann with any of the other murders or bodies that were found there along the beach. There are 2 victims in particular, and I'm going to show you, there were in nearby Manorville, New York, there were 4 victims found, and 2 of those are particularly of interest in this case because part of their body was found there in Manorville, and part of their body was found at Gilgo Beach. Now, there were 4 people total, 2 found at Manorville, 2 were men, and 2, the ones who were found in both Gilgo Beach and Manorville, were female sex workers named Jessica Taylor and Valerie Mack. And police have long suspected John Bittroff. He's a carpenter, and like Heuermann, he was married and a dad. He's now serving 50 years to life for killing 2 sex workers, not those 2, in the early 1990s, Rita Tangredi and Colleen McNamee. He was not sentenced until 2017, which is why it's possible that he could have committed some of the murders. Tangredi's body was found 14 miles from Manorville, McNamee's body 6 miles away. So all of this is sort of in a fairly close range. Both the Long Island Pine Barrens Preserve that you see there near Manorville, Gilgo Beach, and where the 2 other bodies were found. Both of those bodies that Bittroff was convicted of killing, both of those people he was convicted of killing, were posed in a sexual position. They were missing their left shoe. But apparently law enforcement is at least considering Heuermann for some of these murders. And here's how we know that. Law enforcement sources told PIX 11 that Bittroff is being closely looked at in connection with the Manorville killings, but they're also not ruling out Heuermann. So it is possible that they are still going to charge him with that. It looks like right now they don't have any reason to believe he is the killer of those. So now let's keep going over. Let's head over to Las Vegas. We know that law enforcement is looking in Las Vegas. And the way that we know that is that they said, we are aware of Rhett Heuermann's connection to Las Vegas. They told Fox News Digital, we are currently reviewing our unsolved cases to see if he has any involvement. So they're looking specifically at that. Why Las Vegas, you may be wondering? I mean, why that in particular? Well, the reason is because according to the Las Vegas Review-Journal, in 2004, Rhett Heuermann and his wife, Asa Ellerup, bought a timeshare at Club Wyndham Grand Desert east of the Las Vegas Strip. They sold it in 2013, but they also at some point bought a second timeshare, a 2-bedroom timeshare that was 3 miles west of the Strip, and they still own that particular timeshare. Now, there are certain victims that the police are more likely to be looking at. We're going to talk about who those will be specifically. Between 2003 and 2006, 5 escorts, sex workers, were found dead or missing. And there were at least some similarities to the Gilgo Beach murders. They were all women. They were all sex workers. They were between the ages of 18 and 25, and their bodies were found dumped off remote roadways. Several were wrapped in cloth. I tried to find whether it was camouflage burlap type wrap, such as was used with the Gilgo 4, but I wasn't able to find what exactly the cloth was. One or more of them were killed before Rhett Heuermann bought his first timeshare there. But of course, you don't have to own a timeshare to go to Las Vegas. You could go to Las Vegas in any event. We know for sure that there are 2 specific cases that they are looking at and will be comparing DNA that they found at those scenes to Rhett Heuermann's DNA. And let me talk about what those 2 particular cases are. The first is Victoria Camara. Now, Victoria was last seen on August 11th, 2003. She was only 17 years old. She was a teen mom with a 1-year-old. Websleuths.com quotes her cousin, Kayla Donaldson, as saying that Camara turned to prostitution after becoming a single teenage mom and that she struggled to feed herself and her infant child. She just did what she had to do to survive, and unfortunately, that's what she was doing, is what Donaldson said. Donaldson also said that she felt like the reason that Camara's case was never solved and that there was not enough attention to it was because there wasn't a lot of interest because she was a sex worker and people didn't care about her as much. Her body was found, Victoria Camara's body was found in 2003 by a gravel truck driver in the desert just south of the Hall Road. She had been strangled and she had been dumped about 1,200 feet west of US 95. Now, we know for sure that law enforcement is looking at comparing to the DNA, and we know that because they've said that they are testing Rhett Heuermann's DNA to see whether there's a connection to the unsolved murder of a young mother, with one official pointing to scary similarities between the cases. So we know that that's at least something they're looking at. They think there is a possibility that there could be a connection there. Now, we also want to look at Jody Marie Brewer. She was 19 years old, and her mother says she had just fallen in with the wrong crowd and was using drugs and had become a prostitute as a result. She disappeared 3 days after Victoria Camara did, on August 14th, 2003. Her torso was found in the desert, wrapped in cloth and plastic. She had been murdered. She had been dismembered. And we know also that the law enforcement will be looking at this because they have said as much. They are looking at this particular cold case and examining it for possible ties. They're also, you can see in the byline there, looking at Jessie Foster. We'll be talking about her in just a minute. So they are looking for sure at Camara and Jody Marie Brewer to compare the DNA because they actually announced as much as that. There was a third woman, Lindsay Marie Harris, who was also killed in Las Vegas. Here's Lindsay Marie. She was last seen alive on May 4, 2005. She was captured on a bank camera in Henderson, Nevada, which is a Las Vegas suburb, and her rental car was found abandoned in the desert. Her credit cards had been unused. 2 weeks later, her legs, just her legs, were found 1,669 miles away in a grassy field off Interstate 55 near Vernon, Illinois. It's about 15 miles south of Springfield. Her legs were not identified until 2008. But that whole scenario is similar to what happened with one of the Gilgo Beach bodies. There was a woman known as Fire Island Jane Doe for a number of times, Fire Island Jane Doe 7, and she had been dismembered like that. She was identified just a few weeks ago using genetic genealogy tracing as Karen Vergata. So she has now been identified. But there are some differences, obviously, from the Gilgo 4. Police at one point suspected a man named Neil Falls of this particular murder and of some of the other Las Vegas murders. Neil Falls was killed 10 years later in Charleston, West Virginia. He attacked and choked a prostitute, and she, even with a separated shoulder and broken vertebra, managed to grab his handgun from the ground, and she shot and she killed him. The police found a number of highly disturbing items in Neil Falls's trunk. They found a sledgehammer, a bulletproof vest, 2 guns, axes, knives, handcuffs, a shovel, bleach, cleaning supplies. Now, Neil Falls had been stopped, interviewed, or investigated by police in at least 20 states, and still, here he was. Neil Falls had at one point rented a room in Henderson, Nevada, which is one of the reasons he has been traditionally suspected in some of these cases. Police were not able to tie him, however, to Lindsay Harris. There is now speculation about whether Heuermann could have been involved, despite the fact that it seemed different from some of the Gilgo Beach murders. And the reason for that speculation is that we know from the bail document that Heuermann had a Tinder account using the email Springfield Man. Since the legs were found near Springfield, Illinois, there was some suggestion, well, maybe he was connected to these. A fourth young woman who was killed near Las Vegas, Jessie Foster, I say she was killed. This case is actually different because no body was ever found. Jessie Foster disappeared in March of 2006. Her mother says she had been sexually trafficked through New York and New Jersey and then had been lured to Las Vegas. She had several prostitution arrests, but she was last seen alive in, I think I had a slide to show you. Yeah. This is Jessie Foster. She was last seen alive in Las Vegas. But as I said, her body has not been found and her belongings were missing, which was also different, except, bizarrely, her makeup and her hairdryer. And her mother said, why would she take everything and leave her makeup and her hairdryer behind? That makes no sense. So that one also remains unsolved. The fifth person in that area, and this particular article said there was new hope to the mother of Jessie Foster. I didn't find an actual statement or anything from law enforcement suggesting they were reopening that case, and it wouldn't help them to compare the DNA because, of course, they don't have a body. There would be nobody to compare it to. But I think the hope is maybe somehow there will be a confession or somehow they will learn what happened to her. Now, the Misty Saines was 25. She was a sex worker. Bikers discovered her partial remains off State Route 159 near Red Rock Canyon. Her body was wrapped in plastic and a sheet. And again, she, for quite some time, was believed to be one of the victims of Neil Falls. So that wraps up the Las Vegas consideration. But that's not all that Rex Heuermann is considered potentially to have been involved in, because there were also sex workers in Atlantic City who disappeared or whose bodies were found. And for years, people have speculated about whether the Long Island serial killer and the eastbound strangler are the same. Maybe the same person killed these four women that you see here. The bodies of these four women were found close to each other in a drainage ditch behind the Golden Key Motel. It's now been demolished, in a grassy area along Black Horse Pike. They were all sex workers, and they were all found face down with their heads pointed east, no shoes on, no purse, no cell phone, no belongings. The first was Molly Dilts. She had no record for prostitution, but they did believe she was working the area. She was the first to die, and by the time they found her body, they could not determine how she had died. Kim Raffo, age 35, was a waitress from Brooklyn. She had left her husband and children, and because she was a drug addict, she was working as a prostitute. They found her body the day after she disappeared, and she had been strangled to death with a rope or a cord. Barbara Brighter was 42 years old, a sex worker with a cocaine addiction. Tracy Roberts was age 23, and she also sold sex to support her drug habit and disappeared in November of 2006. But, and we do know that they have some DNA from these suspects. We know that because they ruled out one suspect. A handyman at the hotel or the motel was suspected, and they thought maybe he was involved in that. But when they compared his DNA to what they found at the scene, and it didn't match. So he was taken off their suspects list. But theoretically, they could be connected to the Long Island serial killer, to Rex Heuermann, if he's convicted of that. But here's what they concluded. We don't believe that the sex workers killed in Atlantic City are connected to Rex Heuermann. That's what we've heard from the Suffolk County Police Commissioner. And the Atlantic County Prosecutor's Office released a similar statement saying, we are not able to confirm anything like the two of them being connected. So now we go to South Carolina. That's the next stop on the map where we know that law enforcement will be looking. We also know the reason South Carolina is particularly of interest. We know that Rex Heuermann's younger brother, Craig, lives in Chester, South Carolina right now. In July of 2021, Rex Heuermann himself bought 4 secluded and heavily wooded lots near his brother. According to Fox News, neighbors understood that the Heuermanns were going to retire there in South Carolina. We know that law enforcement executed a search warrant there, and the primary thing they were looking for was the dark green 2002 Chevy Avalanche. One of the Gilgo 4 was last seen with a man who drove a car like that. And Rex Heuermann had a car like that, but he had given it apparently to his brother. So that's what they went and found. But law enforcement, at least families, are looking at whether other murders in the area could have been attributed to Rex Heuermann. In our interview with Travis Jenkins, which as soon as this gets processed by YouTube, I can add it in. I'll do a link then. But we did an interview with Travis Jenkins, a newspaper reporter from Chester, South Carolina. And he told us about a particular victim, Melissa Wittes, and her family is really pushing law enforcement to consider whether there's a connection because her murder has never been solved. Her charred body was found, and I'll show you. This is Melissa. Her charred body was found in September 2019. She was from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, but her burned body was found in a ditch in Chester. It took a month to identify her. They finally did that because she had a medical device implanted in her cranium, so they were able to tell that it was actually Melissa. Her family reached out to the media and has asked that there be a consideration of whether Rex Heuermann could have been involved in that. Now, there was also talk about whether Aaliyah Bell, who disappeared from Rock Hill, South Carolina in 2014, could have been connected. This was about 20 miles from the lots that Rex Heuermann had bought. The New York Post said last month that that they had a quote from Rock Hill Lieutenant Michael Chavis, who said, "Our investigators have been reviewing any information to see if there is a correlation between the difference of Aaliyah Bell and Retzi Heuermann. So far, there is no indication that leads us to identify Heuermann as a suspect in this case." So at that point, at least, they were not seeing any kind of connection between what's Retzi Heuermann and Aaliyah Bell. So as you can see, we have done a tour around the country of places where Retzi Heuermann may have been, and law enforcement is looking closely at murders that have happened there. If you had to pick a place where it seems like they are most intrigued at the connections, it would probably be Las Vegas. But right now we know very little about what exactly the mechanism was. How long did Retzi Heuermann have these victims? How did he kill them? We don't know anything about that. So it's difficult to assess whether it could be similar without more knowledge. But we do know law enforcement is looking at that. It's a frightening thought, but I think it's a really smart idea to look, because it seems to me incredibly unlikely that someone would kill 4 people in a 4-year period, never before and never after. That just seems like that seems like a stretch. It seems like if someone did that and continued exactly the same behaviors after that, continued to contact sex workers, continued to do searches, it seems like it would be unlikely that they completely reformed in this one regard. They didn't kill anybody else. Everything else the same, but that was different. It seems unlikely. So I hope you've enjoyed this. Please be sure to hit the like button on your way out. I'd appreciate it. And subscribe. Come back for more. We cover the trending legal cases that everybody is talking about, try to make them understandable. And we go live Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. So I will see you back on Wednesday at 7.